When little Lily Carter stepped into the courtroom, no one could have predicted what she was about to reveal. A custody battle between her father and stepmother was already intense, but when Lily pulled out a hidden letter, everything changed. Secrets that had been buried for years came to light, secrets about her mother's disappearance, her father's true intentions, and a shocking conspiracy that no one saw coming. As the case unfolded, lies unraveled, alliances shifted, and the courtroom turned into a battleground where only the truth could decide Lily's fate. But just when it seemed like justice was finally within reach, a final, desperate move threatened to destroy everything. Who will win this emotional fight for custody? What dark secrets will come to light? And how far will one man go to hold on to control? Stay tuned as we dive into this gripping, twist-filled story that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss an incredible story like this. Don't forget to like, comment, and tell us where you're watching from. What if everything you thought you knew was a lie? What if the person you believed to be the villain was actually the hero? Inside the family court, 8-year-old Lily Carter sat on the witness stand, her small hands gripping the armrests. The judge, an older woman with sharp eyes, leaned forward. The courtroom was silent, waiting for the little girl's words. "Lily," the judge said gently, "do you have something to say about your stepmother, Victoria?" All eyes were on Lily. Her father, Daniel Carter, sat at his lawyer's table, his face expectant. Across the courtroom, Victoria Carter, the woman accused of being an unfit stepmother, sat quietly, her expression unreadable. Lily swallowed. Her voice trembled, but when she spoke, her words shook the entire courtroom. "My stepmom," she said, pausing, "is the best person I know." A wave of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Daniel's lawyer frowned. The judge tapped her gavel once. Daniel's face darkened. He stood up. "Lily, honey, are you confused?" "Victoria is not. I am not confused," Lily interrupted, her voice louder now. "She takes care of me, she loves me, and she's been protecting me from you." The court fell into stunned silence. Daniel turned pale. "What are you saying?" the judge asked, intrigued. Lily reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out an old, crumpled letter. She held it up. "I found this in Daddy's office. It's from my real mom." Victoria's breath hitched. She hadn't expected this. The judge nodded to the court officer, who took the letter and passed it to her. She read the first few lines, then looked up at Daniel. "Mr. Carter, can you explain this?" Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His lawyer whispered something to him, but he didn't respond. Victoria, still silent, watched him closely. She had known something was wrong for years, but she had never imagined this. The judge cleared her throat. "The letter claims that Lily's biological mother did not abandon her, but was forced to leave. Is this true?" Daniel clenched his fists. "This is ridiculous." Lily turned to Victoria, tears in her eyes. "You always told me the truth mattered. I need to know, did my mom really leave me because she wanted to?" Victoria hesitated. Then, softly, she said, "No, sweetheart. She didn't." Gasps filled the courtroom. Even the court reporter stopped typing for a moment. "Enough," Daniel snapped. "This is a custody hearing, not a soap opera." But the judge was not done. She turned to Victoria's lawyer. "Do you have any evidence to support this claim?" Victoria's lawyer, Mark Benson, stood. "Your Honor, we do." He motioned to his assistant, who handed him a folder. "We hired a private investigator. The results are in this file." Daniel's lawyer quickly objected, but the judge allowed the evidence. Mark handed the file to the court clerk, who passed it to the judge. She flipped through the pages, her expression growing graver with each one. Finally, she placed the folder down and looked directly at Daniel. "Mr. Carter, do you have anything to say before I review this in full?" Daniel's jaw tightened. His silence spoke volumes. Victoria exhaled slowly. She had spent years trying to gain custody of Lily, fighting against Daniel's manipulation. Now, for the first time, the court was seeing the truth. Lily took a deep breath. She had been afraid, but now she felt something different. Strength. "Please," she whispered. "Let me stay with Victoria." The judge leaned back, deep in thought. The courtroom held its breath. No one knew that this was only the beginning. The courtroom was thick with tension. Lily's small hands trembled as she wiped a tear from her cheek. The judge carefully placed the letter on her desk, the weight of its words lingering in the air. "Mr. Carter," the judge said, her voice steady, "I need you to answer clearly. Did you force Lily's biological mother to leave?" Daniel Carter's jaw clenched. His lawyer, a sharp-looking man in a gray suit, whispered frantically in his ear. But Daniel barely reacted. The entire courtroom was watching. "I don't know what that letter says," Daniel finally said, his voice tight. "But my ex-wife left us years ago. She abandoned Lily. That's the truth." Lily gripped the edge of her chair. "That's a lie," she shouted. The judge gave her a patient look but did not scold her. Instead, she turned to Victoria's lawyer, Mark Benson. "What evidence do you have?" Mark stood, adjusting his tie. "Your Honor, we have a private investigator's report along with a witness statement." He handed a thick folder to the court clerk, who walked it over to the judge. The court reporter resumed typing, capturing every second of the moment. The judge flipped through the first few pages, her expression tightening. "According to this," she said, "Lily's mother didn't abandon her. She was threatened and forced to leave the country." A stunned murmur spread through the courtroom. Victoria felt her heart pounding. She had suspected Daniel had secrets, but this was beyond what she had imagined. Daniel shot out of his chair. "That's nonsense. My ex-wife left because she didn't want to be a mother. I took care of Lily all these years." Lily shook her head, her voice firm despite her tears. "No, you didn't. You were never there. Victoria was." The judge raised a hand to silence the room. "Mr. Carter, do you deny hiring someone to ensure your ex-wife stayed away?" Daniel's lips pressed together. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. Mark Benson wasn't finished. He gestured toward the back of the courtroom, where the doors creaked open. A middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a hesitant step entered. Lily gasped. "Mom!" A hush fell over the courtroom. Daniel's face turned pale. His lawyer immediately objected. "Your Honor, this is highly inappropriate." The judge cut him off. "Overruled. Let her speak." The woman stepped forward, her voice shaking. "I never wanted to leave my daughter," she said. "Daniel made sure I had no choice." Victoria's grip on the table tightened. She had fought for years to protect Lily, but she had never imagined this moment. The judge turned to Daniel, her expression unreadable. "Do you have anything to say, Mr. Carter?" Daniel exhaled sharply. "She's lying," he said. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Then you won't mind if we verify her story. I'll order an investigation into these claims immediately." For the first time, Daniel looked nervous. His lawyer leaned in, whispering frantically. Lily, still staring at her mother, whispered, "You really didn't leave me?" Tears welled up in the woman's eyes. "No, sweetheart. I wanted to stay, but he wouldn't let me." Lily turned to Victoria, confusion and relief battling in her expression. "You knew, didn't you?" Victoria hesitated. "I suspected, but I never had proof. Until now." The judge tapped her gavel once. "The court will reconvene after reviewing this new evidence." As the room began to clear, Daniel sat frozen, his carefully built story crumbling around him. Outside the courthouse, Victoria knelt beside Lily, holding her close. "No matter what happens, I'll always fight for you," she whispered. Lily nodded, gripping her stepmother's hand. She had walked into that courtroom afraid, but now, for the first time, she felt hope. And the fight was far from over. The family court reconvened the next morning, and tension filled the air like a storm waiting to break. Lily sat beside Victoria, gripping her hand tightly. Across the courtroom, Daniel Carter's expression was unreadable, but the stiffness in his posture betrayed his unease. His lawyer whispered something to him, but he barely reacted. The judge adjusted her glasses and glanced at the report before her. Before we continue, I need to address the claims presented yesterday. Mr. Carter, we now have substantial evidence that contradicts your statement. Your ex-wife did not abandon Lily of her own free will. The private investigator's report, combined with her sworn testimony, suggests that you forced her to leave. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The court reporter's fingers flew across the keyboard, recording every word. Daniel's lawyer quickly stood. Your Honor, my client strongly denies these accusations. There is no concrete proof linking him to any threats against his ex-wife. The judge arched an eyebrow. Is that so? She turned to Victoria's lawyer, Mark Benson. Mr. Benson, do you have anything further to present? Mark nodded. Yes, Your Honor. We have phone records and financial statements showing large sums of money transferred from Mr. Carter's account to an individual known for coercion tactics. He handed the documents to the court clerk, who delivered them to the judge. Daniel's face paled. His fingers drummed anxiously on the table. This is absurd, he snapped. I was protecting my daughter. Her mother was unstable. Lily flinched. Her small fingers tightened around Victoria's. The judge skimmed the papers, then looked up. Mr. Carter, do you deny making these payments? Daniel hesitated. I don't have to explain my finances to this court, he finally said. The judge's eyes narrowed. Actually, you do. The tension in the courtroom was thick, the weight of the truth pressing down on everyone. Lily's mother, Emma Hayes, took a shaky breath and stepped forward. Your Honor, I have something else. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small USB drive. I recorded one of my last conversations with Daniel. The courtroom fell deathly silent. Daniel's lawyer immediately objected. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The judge raised a hand. I will allow it. A court officer took the USB and plugged it into the court's audio system. Seconds later, Daniel's voice filled the room. If you don't leave, you'll never see Lily again. I'll make sure of it. Gasps erupted in the courtroom. Victoria's breath caught in her throat. Sign the papers and disappear. Or I swear, I'll ruin you. The recording ended. The silence that followed was deafening. Lily turned to Daniel, her eyes filled with betrayal. You lied to me? She whispered. Daniel clenched his jaw, his face a mask of fury and desperation. You don't understand, the judge tapped her gavel. Enough. She turned to Daniel's lawyer. Do you still wish to argue your client's innocence? Daniel's lawyer, looking visibly shaken, sighed. Your Honor, I need to speak with my client privately. The judge nodded. I suggest you do that quickly. We will reconvene in an hour. Mr. Carter remained in the courthouse. As people filed out, Victoria turned to Lily and brushed a strand of hair from her face. Are you okay, sweetheart? Lily swallowed hard, then nodded. I don't know who my dad really is anymore. Victoria hugged her gently. No matter what happens in that courtroom, you are loved. Lily exhaled, finding strength in Victoria's words. She wasn't alone in this fight, but the battle for the truth was far from over. An hour later, the family court reconvened. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension as everyone took their seats. Lily sat beside Victoria, her small hands clenched into fists. Across the room, Daniel Carter sat rigidly, his lawyer whispering urgently in his ear. The judge entered, tapping her gavel once. After reviewing the evidence and the audio recording presented earlier, this court must address a serious concern, she said, her sharp gaze fixed on Daniel. Mr. Carter, do you have anything to say before I proceed? Daniel's lawyer stood quickly. Your Honor, my client wishes to exercise his right to remain silent until we can fully analyze the authenticity of the recording. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Victoria's lawyer, Mark Benson sighed and shook his head. Your Honor, the evidence is clear. The recording matches Mr. Carter's voice. The financial records confirm payments made to someone who allegedly forced Emma Hayes out of the country. What more do we need before we acknowledge the truth? The judge nodded. I agree. The evidence against Mr. Carter is significant. She turned to Daniel. Mr. Carter, given what we have heard today, I strongly advise you to cooperate with this court. Daniel stood abruptly, his face red with frustration. This is ridiculous. I raised Lily. I provided for her. And now you're all against me? His voice rose, making Lily shrink back in her seat. The judge's gavel struck the desk. Mr. Carter, I will not tolerate outbursts in my courtroom. Sit down. Daniel hesitated, but eventually dropped into his chair. His jaw clenched. His lawyer placed a firm hand on his arm, whispering urgently. Victoria glanced at Lily, worry creasing her face. She leaned down and whispered, You're doing so well, sweetheart. Just hold on a little longer. Lily nodded, though her heart pounded. The truth was finally coming out, but it didn't make it any less terrifying. The judge turned to Emma Hayes. Ms. Hayes, I understand how difficult this must be. But I need to ask, why did you not return sooner? Why wait until now to come forward? Emma took a deep breath, her voice trembling. Because I was afraid. Daniel made it clear that if I tried to come back, he would make sure I never saw my daughter again. I had no way to fight him. She paused, then looked at Victoria. But then, I heard that Victoria was in a custody battle for Lily. That gave me hope. I knew I had to come back and tell the truth. Victoria reached over and squeezed Emma's hand. For years, she had been fighting this battle alone. Now, she wasn't the only one standing against Daniel. The judge sighed. This court does not take accusations of coercion lightly. Given the overwhelming evidence, I am considering an emergency ruling regarding Lily's custody. Daniel shot up again. You can't do this. She's my daughter. The judge's gavel struck again, her patience wearing thin. Mr. Carter, you are dangerously close to contempt of court. I suggest you compose yourself. Daniel's lawyer pulled him back into his seat, whispering furiously. Victoria watched Daniel closely. He had always been confident, always in control. But now, for the first time, she saw something new in his eyes: fear. The judge continued. For the safety and well-being of the child, this court is issuing a temporary ruling. Effective immediately, custody of Lily Carter will be granted to Victoria Carter and Emma Hayes until further investigation is completed. A wave of relief washed over Victoria. She turned to Lily, whose eyes widened in shock. I get to stay with you? Lily whispered. Victoria smiled, tears welling up in her eyes. Yes, sweetheart, you do. Emma covered her mouth, overcome with emotion. Daniel, however, wasn't finished. He slammed his hands on the table. You can't take her away from me. The judge fixed him with a stern gaze. Mr. Carter, I suggest you think carefully about your next actions. This court will not tolerate threats or intimidation. If you wish to challenge this ruling, you may do so legally. Daniel's fists clenched, but he didn't argue further. He had lost control, and he knew it. The judge tapped her gavel one last time. This court is adjourned for today. We will reconvene after reviewing the remaining evidence. As the courtroom emptied, Victoria knelt beside Lily. You're safe now, she whispered. Lily nodded, leaning into Victoria's embrace. But deep inside, Victoria knew this fight wasn't over. Daniel wasn't the type to back down easily, and she had a feeling he had one last trick up his sleeve. Victoria held Lily close as they stepped out of the courtroom, the air still heavy with the echoes of the judge's ruling. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of relief, but it was fragile, like glass that could shatter at any moment. Beside her, Emma Hayes wiped away tears, still overwhelmed by the reality that she had her daughter back, even if only temporarily. I can't believe this is happening, she whispered. Victoria nodded. We're one step closer, but it's not over yet. And she was right. Just as they reached the hallway of the courthouse, Daniel Carter stormed out behind them, his lawyer struggling to keep up. His face was red with fury. You think this is over? He hissed, his voice low but venomous. You took my daughter from me in that courtroom, but I promise you, this fight isn't finished. Victoria straightened, shielding Lily behind her. You lost custody because of your own actions, Daniel. Not because of us. Daniel's jaw tightened. His lawyer tugged at his arm. We need to go, he murmured. For a long moment, Daniel didn't move. Then, with a cold glare, he turned and stormed down the courthouse hallway. Emma exhaled shakily. He's not going to stop, is he? Victoria shook her head. No, but we'll be ready. When the court reconvened the following morning, the tension was thicker than ever. Victoria sat beside her lawyer, Mark Benson, while Lily held her hand tightly. Across the room, Emma sat with quiet determination. Then Daniel entered. But something was different. He looked composed, even smug, a sharp contrast to his rage from the day before. Victoria's stomach twisted. The judge tapped her gavel. We are here to continue proceedings regarding the custody of Lily Carter. Mr. Carter, your legal team has filed an urgent motion. I will allow you to state your request. Daniel's lawyer stood, adjusting his tie. Your Honor, my client is requesting immediate reconsideration of the temporary custody order based on newly discovered evidence. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Victoria stiffened. What was he planning? The judge frowned. And what evidence would that be? Daniel's lawyer pulled out a folder and handed it to the court clerk, who passed it to the judge. Your Honor, this is a sworn affidavit from a former employee of Mrs. Victoria Carter. It contains claims that she has a history of emotional instability and is unfit to be a guardian for a child. Victoria's breath caught in her throat. What? The judge scanned the document, her expression unreadable. Mark Benson quickly stood. Your Honor, this is a blatant attempt to discredit my client without merit. Who is this so-called witness? Daniel's lawyer smiled thinly. A former housekeeper. She worked for Mrs. Carter for 2 years and personally witnessed concerning behavior. Victoria's hands curled into fists. She knew exactly who they were talking about, Martha Reynolds, a woman she had fired last year for theft. This is ridiculous, Victoria said, her voice firm. That woman was dismissed for stealing from my home. Daniel's lawyer raised an eyebrow. Yet there was never a formal police report, was there? Victoria's pulse pounded. He was twisting the truth. The judge sighed. I will review this document, but I expect solid proof to back these claims. Until then, the current custody arrangement remains in place. Victoria exhaled, but she knew this was only the beginning. Daniel was playing dirty. As the courtroom emptied, Daniel walked past Victoria and leaned in just enough for her to hear. You're not the only one who can fight, sweetheart. Victoria turned to Mark, her voice low. We need to be ready. He's not done yet. And she was right. The real battle had just begun. Victoria sat stiffly at the plaintiff's table as the courtroom filled once more. The air was thick with tension, each side waiting for the next blow to land. Across from her, Daniel Carter sat with an unsettling calmness, his lawyer flipping through papers as if he had already won. Lily squeezed Victoria's hand, her small fingers trembling. Will they believe what he said? She whispered. Victoria gave her a reassuring squeeze. The truth always comes out, sweetheart. We just have to be patient. The judge entered, her expression unreadable as she tapped her gavel. This court will now review the affidavit presented by Mr. Carter's legal team. I have examined the claims against Mrs. Carter, and I have questions. She turned to Victoria. Mrs. Carter, do you deny that your former housekeeper, Martha Reynolds, was dismissed under questionable circumstances? Victoria sat up straighter. Your Honor, I dismissed Martha Reynolds because I caught her stealing. I chose not to press charges, but she was terminated immediately. Daniel's lawyer stood. Your Honor, without a formal police report, my client argues that this is merely an excuse. Furthermore, Ms. Reynolds has provided testimony that Mrs. Carter was frequently emotionally unstable and unfit to care for a child. Victoria clenched her jaw. That's a lie. She's retaliating because I fired her. The judge nodded. Do you have any evidence to support that claim? Victoria turned to her lawyer, Mark Benson, who stood confidently. Yes, Your Honor. We have security footage from Mrs. Carter's home showing Ms. Reynolds taking valuables from the house. Furthermore, we have financial records indicating that she was caught selling stolen items just weeks after being dismissed. He handed a folder to the court clerk, who brought it to the judge. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. Daniel's lawyer's smug expression faded slightly. The judge scanned the documents, then looked up. This evidence does raise concerns about Ms. Reynolds' credibility. Mr. Carter, do you have anything further to submit? Daniel stood. Your Honor, my concern is for Lily. Victoria is trying to take my daughter away from me. I was a single father for years, and now suddenly, I'm being treated like the villain? Victoria exhaled sharply. You're not the villain because you were a single father. You're the villain because you lied and forced Emma out of Lily's life. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. The judge tapped her gavel. Silence. Lily suddenly stood, surprising everyone. Can I say something? The judge hesitated, then nodded. Go ahead, Lily. The little girl took a deep breath. I love my dad, but he didn't take care of me. Victoria did. She was the one who made sure I had food, who helped me with school, who hugged me when I had bad dreams. Her voice shook, but she stood her ground. I don't want to live with my dad. I want to stay with Victoria and my mom. A heavy silence settled over the courtroom. Even Daniel looked momentarily shaken. The judge sighed, folding her hands. This court takes the well-being of a child very seriously. Given Lily's statement and the evidence presented, I see no reason to alter the current custody arrangement at this time. Victoria let out a slow breath, but Daniel wasn't finished. His lips curled into a smirk. If that's how you want to play it, he murmured under his breath. Victoria's stomach twisted. He had another move left, and she wasn't sure she was ready for it. The tension in the courtroom hadn't faded. If anything, it had grown thicker, like a storm gathering strength. Victoria could feel it in the way Daniel sat, too calm, too confident, as if he knew something they didn't. Lily still stood beside Victoria, her small frame tense after her emotional plea. The judge had acknowledged her words, but the battle was far from over. Daniel leaned back in his chair, a smirk tugging at his lips. Your Honor, while I respect Lily's feelings, a child doesn't always understand what's best for them. That's why we have the court to decide. Victoria's lawyer, Mark Benson, stiffened. Your Honor, the child's well-being is paramount. Lily has clearly stated where she feels safe and loved. That should not be ignored. The judge nodded. I agree, which is why the current custody arrangement remains. Daniel didn't flinch. Instead, he slowly stood, adjusting his tie. I assumed you'd say that, Your Honor, which is why I'd like to introduce new evidence. Victoria's stomach twisted. What was he doing? Daniel's lawyer stood beside him. We have a sworn statement from a child psychologist, Dr. Rebecca Hall, who has evaluated Lily in the past and has concerns regarding Mrs. Carter's ability to provide a stable environment. Victoria's breath caught. That's impossible. Lily has never been evaluated by a psychologist under my care. Daniel turned, his smirk widening. That's funny because I took her to one last year. Lily's hand tightened around Victoria's. Dad took me to a lady once, but I thought she was just asking questions. Mark Benson stood. Your Honor, this is a clear manipulation tactic. Any evaluation done without Mrs. Carter's knowledge is highly questionable. The courtroom buzzed as the judge considered. Let me see the report. The court clerk retrieved a folder from Daniel's lawyer and handed it to the judge. She skimmed it carefully. Dr. Hall's report states that Lily showed signs of emotional distress. She also noted inconsistencies in her home life. Mr. Carter, this document does not explicitly state that Mrs. Carter is unfit. Daniel frowned. But it raises concerns, doesn't it? Victoria's lawyer leaned forward. Your Honor, Dr. Hall was selected by Mr. Carter and likely received biased information. I request a new, independent psychological evaluation of Lily. The judge sighed. I find this new evidence insufficient to make any immediate changes. However, to ensure all parties are acting in Lily's best interest, I will grant a court-appointed psychologist to evaluate the child before a final ruling is made. Victoria exhaled, but Daniel's smirk remained. He had expected this. The judge tapped her gavel. This court will reconvene in 1 week to review the findings. Victoria turned to Lily and whispered, It's going to be okay. We'll tell the truth. But as she looked at Daniel's smug expression, she knew one thing for certain. He wasn't done playing his games. And the next time they entered this courtroom, he'd be more dangerous than ever. A week had passed, but the tension in the courtroom was just as thick as before. The family court was filled with reporters, lawyers, and spectators, all waiting for the moment that could determine Lily's future. Victoria sat with her lawyer, Mark Benson, her heart pounding as she glanced across the room. Daniel Carter was seated at his table, his usual smug expression in place. But Victoria had learned something over the years. People who thought they were winning always looked the most confident right before they lost. The judge entered and tapped her gavel. This court is now in session. We are here to review the psychological evaluation of Lily Carter and determine whether custody should be reconsidered. Victoria held Lily's hand tightly as the court clerk handed a thick folder to the judge. The room was so silent that the sound of paper turning seemed deafening. After a long pause, the judge looked up. The court-appointed psychologist has completed their evaluation of Lily Carter. According to this report, Lily has shown signs of anxiety related to her father's behavior and expresses a strong preference to remain with Mrs. Carter and her biological mother, Emma Hayes. A hushed murmur spread through the courtroom. Victoria felt Lily exhale beside her, as if she had been holding her breath for days. Daniel's lawyer quickly stood. Your Honor, children sometimes say what they think adults want to hear. We cannot assume that a child's preference alone is enough to determine custody. Mark Benson stood immediately. Your Honor, while it's true that children may be influenced, this report doesn't just include Lily's words. The psychologist observed her interactions with both parties. The findings show that she feels secure with Mrs. Carter and her mother, while her interactions with Mr. Carter caused visible distress. The judge turned back to the report, nodding. Indeed, the psychologist also noted that Lily seemed fearful when discussing her father's anger issues. Daniel's face turned red. This is insane. My daughter loves me. The judge raised a stern hand. Mr. Carter, I suggest you remain silent unless spoken to. Daniel's lawyer leaned in, whispering frantically, but Daniel shook his head in frustration. The judge continued. Additionally, the report raises concerns about Mr. Carter's motivations. It appears that his insistence on sole custody is tied to financial incentives rather than the child's well-being. Victoria's breath caught. She turned to Mark, who gave her a knowing look. This was it. The judge gestured to the court clerk, who handed over another folder. Mr. Carter, financial records have been submitted indicating that you have accumulated significant debt in recent years. Your insistence on obtaining full custody coincides with your daughter's upcoming inheritance from a trust left by her maternal grandparents. Gasps filled the courtroom. Lily's grip on Victoria's hand tightened. Daniel's lawyer quickly stood. Your Honor, my client's financial situation is irrelevant to this case. The judge cut him off. It is highly relevant when it suggests an ulterior motive for seeking custody. She turned to Daniel. "Do you deny that you are in financial trouble?" Daniel's jaw tightened. That money was meant for Lily's future. The judge's expression hardened. Yet the report shows a pattern of reckless spending and debt accumulation, suggesting otherwise. Victoria watched as Daniel's confidence finally cracked. His face paled, and his fingers drummed anxiously on the table. The judge sighed and turned to Lily. "Lily, do you still feel the same way about where you want to live?" Lily nodded firmly. "Yes, Your Honor. I want to stay with Victoria and my mom." The judge leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. "In light of all the evidence presented, this court will make its final decision tomorrow." The gavel struck, and the session ended. As they left the courtroom, Victoria felt a sense of hope. The truth was finally on their side. But she knew Daniel Carter well enough to understand one thing: he wasn't going to accept defeat easily. The morning air outside the courthouse was crisp, but inside the courtroom, the tension was suffocating. Today was the final hearing. The judge would deliver the ruling that would decide Lily's future. Victoria sat at the plaintiff's table, her hands clasped tightly together. Beside her, Lily leaned against her, quiet but steady. Across the room, Emma Hayes sat, her eyes flickering with both hope and fear. Then there was Daniel Carter. He looked composed, but Victoria recognized the tightness in his jaw, the restless tapping of his fingers against the table. He was cornered and he knew it. But she also knew men like Daniel didn't accept defeat easily. The judge entered, and the courtroom fell silent. The sound of the gavel echoed through the room. This court is now in session for the final custody ruling of Lily Carter. Victoria inhaled sharply. This was it. The judge turned to Daniel. "Mr. Carter, after reviewing the psychological report, the financial documents, and the testimony presented in this courtroom, it is clear that your actions have been driven by self-interest rather than your daughter's well-being." Daniel's lawyer quickly stood. "Your Honor, my client loves his daughter. Any financial struggles he may have had are irrelevant to his ability to be a good father." The judge's gaze was firm. The financial struggles are relevant when they directly impact his motives for custody. Furthermore, the psychological report indicates that Lily has expressed fear and discomfort regarding her father's temper. That is not something this court can ignore. Daniel stood abruptly. "This isn't fair. Victoria poisoned my daughter against me. She's been manipulating her from the start." Victoria's lawyer, Mark Benson, shot up from his seat. "Objection. Mr. Carter is making baseless accusations." The judge tapped her gavel. "Enough. Mr. Carter, if you cannot remain composed, I will hold you in contempt of court." Daniel gritted his teeth, but slowly sat down. The judge continued. "This court does not take removing parental rights lightly. However, given the evidence, I find that granting Mr. Carter full custody would not be in the child's best interest." Victoria's breath caught. The judge looked directly at Lily. "Lily, this court has heard your wishes. Do you still stand by them?" Lily lifted her chin. "Yes, Your Honor. I want to stay with Victoria and my mom." Daniel scoffed. "She's a child. She doesn't know what she wants." The judge's gaze snapped to him. "Mr. Carter, a child knows where she feels safe. And based on everything presented in this courtroom, that place is not with you." A hush spread through the courtroom. Victoria braced herself. The judge exhaled. "This court awards full custody of Lily Carter to Victoria Carter and Emma Hayes." A wave of relief crashed over Victoria. Emma gasped softly, covering her mouth. Lily clung to Victoria, whispering, "We won." Victoria hugged her tightly. "Yes, sweetheart. We won." But across the courtroom, Daniel was shaking with rage. His lawyer leaned in, whispering something urgently, but he wasn't listening. Then, without warning, he shot up from his chair. "This isn't over," he bellowed. "You think you can take my daughter from me?" The court officers moved instantly, stepping between him and Victoria's table. The judge slammed her gavel. "Mr. Carter, you are in contempt of court." Victoria held Lily close as Daniel was restrained. His shouts echoed as he was escorted out of the courtroom. The fight was finally over. Victoria exhaled, looking down at Lily, whose small face was pressed against her shoulder. "You're safe now," she whispered. And, for the first time, she truly believed it. The gavel's final strike still echoed in Victoria's mind as she stepped out of the courthouse. The cool morning air brushed against her skin, but she barely felt it. The past few weeks had been an exhausting battle, fought within the walls of the courtroom, where every word, every piece of evidence, and every truth had been weighed. And now at last it was over. She glanced down at Lily, who walked beside her, clutching her hand tightly. The little girl had been through so much, forced to relive painful memories in front of strangers in the court. And yet, she had stood strong. "You okay, sweetheart?" Victoria asked softly. Lily nodded, but didn't speak. Her grip on Victoria's hand tightened. Behind them, Emma Hayes wiped her eyes, exhaling deeply. "I still can't believe it," she murmured. "After all these years, we finally have her back." Victoria turned to her. "It's real, Emma? No more threats. No more court battles. She's safe." Emma nodded, but her gaze flickered toward the courthouse doors, where Daniel Carter had been led away in handcuffs for contempt of court. "Do you think he'll try again?" Victoria hesitated. She knew Daniel. A man like him didn't accept defeat easily. But this time, the law had spoken. He had lost. "I don't know," she admitted. "But we'll be ready." As if sensing the tension, Lily finally spoke. "I don't want to talk about Dad anymore." Her voice was small but firm. Victoria and Emma exchanged a glance. Emma knelt beside her daughter, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You don't have to, sweetheart. From now on, we focus on what's ahead. Okay?" Lily hesitated, then nodded. "Okay." The past week had been filled with adjustments, but for the first time in years, Victoria felt a sense of peace. There were no more emergency court hearings, no more lawyers sending urgent emails, no more living in fear of what Daniel might do next. They had moved into a new home, a house with a big backyard, where Lily could play without fear of her father showing up unannounced. The transition hadn't been easy, but Victoria and Emma had worked hard to make it feel safe. One afternoon, as Victoria set the table for dinner, she heard laughter from outside. Peering through the window, she saw Emma and Lily tossing a ball back and forth. Lily was laughing, really laughing. It was a sound Victoria hadn't heard in a long time. A lump formed in her throat. This was what they had fought for. Emma caught her watching and smiled. "You okay?" she called. Victoria nodded. "Yeah, just taking it all in." Later that night, as they tucked Lily into bed, the little girl looked up at them with wide, sleepy eyes. "I have two moms now," she murmured. Emma smiled, brushing a kiss against her forehead. "That's right, sweetheart." Victoria ruffled her hair. "And we love you more than anything in the world." Lily's eyes fluttered closed, a peaceful expression settling over her face. As Victoria and Emma stepped out of the room, Victoria exhaled. "We really did it, didn't we?" Emma nodded. "We did." Outside, the world moved on. The courtroom was empty now. The judge had moved on to other cases, and Daniel Carter was no longer a looming threat in their lives. But in their home, a new chapter had begun. One built on love, trust, and a future where Lily would never have to be afraid again. Lily was finally safe, surrounded by love, and free from the battles fought in the courtroom. This was more than just a legal victory. It was a fresh start, a chance for healing, and proof that the truth always prevails. What did you think of this story? Let us know in the comments. And tell us, where in the world are you watching from? We love hearing from our viewers across the globe. If you enjoyed this story and want more gripping, emotional, and unexpected twists, make sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. See you in the next story.